we defend the struggles of peoples in resistance fighting for their rights. Between Borders. All about equity, diversity, and respect for identity on By Gender. Every day we feature a wide variety of content. Only on teleSUR, the news source from Latin America and the Caribbean. A sign of resistance to hatred and injustice, Bill Fletcher Jr. conducts a discussion and analysis space to reveal the social struggles of Black people on the Global Africa. Wednesdays, only on teleSUR. During all this time, they have been with us to report the realities shivering the world, supporting and sharing our victories. Due to their work, we are currently in more places and will still be in the voice of the people. The news source from Latin America and the Caribbean.
You're watching teleSUR English. I am Estefania Bravo, and these are the headlines at this hour. Venezuela's Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza has started his second leg of his diplomatic tour around Latin America and the Caribbean. He's in Dominica today and will travel to El Salvador and the Dominican Republic. This comes at an important time as the presidential election will be held on April 22nd. Venezuela hopes to strengthen diplomatic ties with countries of the region. Ecuador's President Lenín Moreno is expected in Colombia today to meet with President Juan Manuel Santos. Afternoon meetings will be held between different ministers of Colombia and Ecuador to discuss topics such as security and defense, infrastructure, environmental, economic, and commercial issues. Tomorrow, the heads of state will discuss topics such as the peace talks with the ELN and the Colombian government in the city of Quito. The head of the Colombian military forces said there is zero chance the army will cross the border into Venezuela. He was responding to Venezuela's state prosecutor Tarek William Saab, who said that Bogotá was planning to attack the country. Last week, the Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos promised to send more than 3,000 troops and police to the border to control the entry of Venezuelan immigrants.
It's a very professional assignment geared toward eliminating some illegal trails in specific predetermined areas, including areas that have been coordinated in the past with Venezuelan authorities. So the chance that some troops or men from the armed forces will cross to the other side of the border for action or by mistake or because they are lost is zero, absolutely zero.
Social movements in El Salvador are demanding that the Arena Party gives back donations made to victims of the 2001 earthquakes. Social organizations marched toward the Supreme Electoral Tribunal asking for the Arena Party to be disqualified. They say the party misappropriated $10 million donated by Taiwan's government by using it for its electoral campaign. Elections will be held on the 4th of March. In Bolivia, another explosion in the city of Oruro killed 2 people. According to official reports, 10 people were also injured and transferred to local hospitals. The blast destroyed several buildings and vehicles around the block. Oruro's governor, Víctor Hugo Vázquez, said the explosion is being investigated as a criminal attack. A Palestinian judge banned journalists from attending the trial of teenager Ahed Tamimi in an Israeli military court. Her first court session on Tuesday lasted for 2 hours. Her next hearing will be held on March 11th. 17-year-old Tamimi was arrested last December after a viral video showed her slapping and kicking 2 Israeli soldiers in the occupied West Bank. And those are the headlines at this hour. For these and more stories, go to our website at telesurtv.net/English.
Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best. Here on teleSUR.
El cargo de presidente de la República
Mexico's transition to democracy has not been a linear path of progress. From the late 80s, with the split in the Revolutionary Institutional Party, to the triumph of the conservatives in 2000, to the return of the ruling party, it's been a bumpy road. There are few people who know this process as well or have played such an active role in it as Porfirio Muñoz Ledo. Here on Interviews from Mexico, we'll be talking to Porfirio Muñoz Ledo about Mexican democracy in this critical election year. Stay tuned.
El país con el gobierno del PRI no va por el camino correcto.
Se han hecho las reformas constitucionales.
Es necesario terminar con la guerra.
To talk about these big issues, we have a uniquely qualified guest with us here today. Porfirio Muñoz Ledo, former congressman, Secretary of Labor and Education, co-founder of the Democratic Front, and currently commissioner of the Political Reform Commission in Mexico City, among many other titles and achievements. Mr. Muñoz Ledo, thank you so much for being with us today on Interviews from Mexico.
Thanks to you, Laurita.
We could go on with the extensive curriculum of Mr. Muñoz Ledo, and for viewers who are interested, there's a new book out. It's called Historia Oral, Oral History, and it covers the period from 1933 to 1988 in the life of Porfirio Muñoz Ledo, which also covers the major events of which he was an active part in Mexico during that period. But for now, I want to go straight into the interview. Many people have said that there are parallels between the elections this year in 2008 and what you witnessed in 1988. As a co-founder of the Democratic Front, you witnessed and you protested against fraud in the presidential elections of 1988. And you said in a recent column, the backdrop today is the same. A small group in power and an sensational technocracy determined to block democratic change.
Exactly.
In this context, can we expect another fraud in 2018 elections?
Look, we're in a very similar situation. In 1988, we made a huge effort to make the election democratic. But the government of Miguel de la Madrid carried out a post-electoral fraud. They didn't think they were going to lose. When they saw the number, they got really scared.
When the election results were coming in.
Exactly, that's a post-electoral fraud, in the sense that they changed the acts of the election, no, and the votes.
So they changed everything after the election. Now they are talking preventive measures. It's a different kind of fraud. It's a pre-electoral fraud. They're using public resources, they're using social programs, they're using all kinds of resources to prevent free elections.
What can the society do to prevent this kind of fraud if it's almost inevitable in these elections?
We are creating a national movement with intellectuals and journalists to confront the country's electoral authorities. I have the documents. I'll send them to you. We're going to confront the country's election authorities in a public debate, including the National Electoral Institute, the Electoral Tribunal, and the FEPADE, the electoral prosecutor. We are going to create a large social movement to prevent.
So first of all, it's holding the authorities accountable.
Yes,
we have
of
a different situation here because in 1988 we didn't have the electoral infrastructure that we have now, and now we have it, but there's still room for fraud?
It's a big deception. I took part in the negotiations in 1994 after the death of Colosio and the uprising in Chiapas. when the government gave in and allowed the first autonomous electoral structures. Then, in 1996, I did the same thing again. So by 1997, we got finally autonomous electoral structures. That's how we won the majority in the Congress. That's how I was president of. And then the first alternation of power with Vicente Fox. But then the system became corrupted, totally corrupted, because the political parties once again took power over the electoral bodies. Vicente Fox threw democracy out of the window. So what happened? After we achieved opposition majorities and an alternation in government, what happened next were electoral frauds. Vicente Fox, it was him who directed the electoral fraud against López Obrador. You remember how famous that was. He confessed it. I got my revenge, he said, of course. So the most fraudulent of all, more than the PRI, was Fox. Then came the electoral fraud of that, well, that was 2006, and then came the fraud in 2012, which brought Peña Nieto into power. And then in 2015, there were the brutal frauds in the states of Mexico and Coahuila. So we're confronting a very difficult situation, but we have several advantages. First, López Obrador is too far ahead from them to cover it up. Second, there will be a social movement to pin down the electoral agencies so that they fulfill their obligations. And we hope to receive support from international organizations as well.
It's a little worrisome that there was just what appears to be a serious fraud in Honduras, and there was serious, kind of
very serious fraud.
Minimal international reaction so far to that. Do you think they can still get away with something like that in Mexico?
What we need is for an international audience to have a clear idea that the freedom fighters are us. You know what I mean? There is no awareness that the PRI is the embodiment of corruption. There is no international awareness that the PRI is authoritarian, that the PRI engages in electoral fraud, because there is a certain amount of international complicity with the current situation in Mexico. You know what I mean? So any authoritarian regime around the world gets criticized, except for the PRI. I watch CNN every day, for example. There is never any criticism of the PRI as an authoritarian regime. It's the most authoritarian regime in Latin America.
Well, you have written extensively about this and documented the dictatorship, the authoritarianism of the PRI. To defend the vote, what's going to have to happen to break through this international image of, well, maybe not everything's perfect in Mexico, but they have a democratic government?
No, well, there are three tasks. You just mentioned the first one. Like I said, there is an international complicity with the PRI. It's not that they don't know. There are correspondents from all over the world here, and they're not stupid, and they're not blind. You know what I mean? But still, because it's convenient for them, the great powers, especially the United States, to give their Mexican regime democratic credentials. And that's absolutely absurd. It's the most authoritarian regime in Latin America. Name another regime that's more authoritarian. Maybe in Honduras. That is, so it's proved historical. So first, to raise international awareness about the authoritarian character of the Mexican regime. Second, a social and intellectual mobilization, which we are organizing to confront the electoral authorities. And then a strong attitude in the part of citizens, because if in 2018, this year, there's an electoral fraud, there could be a popular insurrection.
And would this be the electoral observation that you're talking about? Are you already laying the base?
Yeah, but it needs to be done seriously. The election observation, unfortunately, which we have been promoting since 1994, in 1994 when we negotiated with Dr. Cedillo, with the former government still, with Carpizo, that there will be electoral observation. People from the European Union came, a lot of people came from all over the world. But on the day of election, they were acting like tourists. They didn't know what happened before, you know? The electoral observation process should start at the beginning of the electoral process. They come, they watch the votes being counted, but they don't know what this is all being perverted behind the votes.
Especially now when we're not talking about a post-electoral fraud so much as everything that's already starting to happen, maybe.
Exactly. So that they show up on election day. I invited, for example, I was ambassador to the European Union. I invited the European Parliament, and they said everything was okay because they just watched the votes being counted. But they didn't see everything behind the election, the vote being blocked. So electoral observation can't just be on election day. The entire process needs to be observed, and no one can guarantee.
How do you guarantee a mobilization of the people in defense of the vote? And was that what was lacking in 1988?
In 1988, there was a very important mobilization. The Zócalo was filled up several times. What happened is that the decision was not made to confront the government non-violently, because the political parties in the coalition preferred to accept positions in Congress. For the first time, the opposition had 45%. That was a lot for them, 180 deputies. They were stunned. And they didn't make the fundamental decisions. If they had, they wouldn't have had to back down.
Well, I wanted to go back to then and the formation of the Democratic Front, which was such a key moment in the transition to democracy in Mexico, which has had its advances.
To democracy, to what?
To what, right. And at that time, there were 3 points that you brought out. First of all, national sovereignty, the economic model of concentration, a critique of that economic model, and the system of decision-making at the time. Let's look quickly at those 3. First of all, national sovereignty. You said recently that power is being exercised from abroad in Mexico, and that's reflected in the renegotiation of NAFTA and in the context of U.S. national security.
Well, it was, look, the government of Miguel de la Madrid had been weakened by international pressure. I was the ambassador of Mexico to the United Nations. I was a personal friend of the president. I spoke several times with Miguel de la Madrid, and I was a witness to what happened in October of 1994, when Miguel just went up to Washington. We were all there, the ambassadors in Washington, the president of the Inter-American Bank, who was Antonio Ortiz Mena. We talked with de la Madrid. He gave up everything, accepted all their conditions, in order to establish the Baker Plan. They put the conditions in everything. The privatizations, the whole neoliberal scheme, the deregulations, the privatizations. We were totally shocked. I had a different line in the United Nations. I had been the president of the Group of 77. They had a project to promote national sovereignty. So we started to have problems with the government. Of course. Second, the issue of a popular decision about the elections. The famous finger system. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas and I, without having talked to each other in 2 different places, he was the governor of Michoacán and I was the ambassador to the United Nations. We spoke against the finger system.
And that was really the origins of the Democratic Front.
So we successfully created a public awareness against the finger system. How we did it? By nominating a candidate within the party. It was allowed under the rules of the party, the statutes, to propose a candidate. It was allowed, but no one did it. So we ran a candidate inside the party, who was Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. And it caused a scandal at the 13th Assembly of the party, where they censored us. So we had to split.
How could you do this?
They didn't have the sensibility to accept a candidate from within the party. Like happens in the whole world, the primaries. There is no place on earth where candidates don't run against each other before the open electoral process. But in Mexico it was prohibited, the pre-prohibited, for there to be various candidates for elections. So we had to split. We fought him in the general election, and we won the elections.
And that was really the start of a big moment in a democratic transition. And it went from there to then the election of another party in 2000, and then the return of the PRI. Where are we now? Why has this democratic transition that was unleashed at that moment, why did it stall?
No, the democratic tradition was aborted. Vicente Fox aborted it. Instead of dismantling the old system, he consolidated it. And he betrayed democracy by undertaking a campaign against López Obrador. No president of the PRI was so bold-faced and cynical about meddling in an electoral campaign. You know what I mean? And distorting the principle of universal suffrage.
In that sense, then, in 2006, the candidacy of Andrés Manuel López Obrador represented a possibility to again advance in a democratic transition. Is that the case now, too?
Of course it was. Of course it was. Because it was a game that the government was playing. In 2000, all of us helped bring Fox to power, and in 2006 he betrayed us. And then Calderón betrayal, helping Peña Nieto, was totally fraudulent, totally fraudulent.
There's a lot of documentation that...
It's documented that Peña Nieto is an illegitimate president. He is illegitimate.
And yet he's in charge of these elections. Although in a recent interview you indicated that power has passed to his Secretary of International Relations, to Vidigaray. So what's going on?
During one part of the Mexican Revolution, there was a strongman, Calles, General Calles, after the death of General Obregón. So I call him Luis el Callecito, little Calles, it's like a little street. Because they gave him power, just like De la Madrid passes over power to Salinas. Before leaving office, Peña Nieto passed power over to Videgaray because he is the link to the United States. He brought Trump here. The first state visit, Trump visited Mexico just to keep bashing us.
In this sense of national sovereignty, you mentioned this critical moment when De la Madrid went to the first debt and renegotiation and basically gave away everything. What about now?
The big expectation is that the free trade agreement, NAFTA, will be renegotiated after the presidential elections. The White House has already agreed to that. There are clear messages that they prefer to renegotiate NAFTA with whoever is the next president of Mexico. This is very important because it will be a false treaty. Relationship with the United States should be defined by the next government.
There's already been a huge path toward a greater alliance, some would say, and intervention, others would say, particularly in the field of national security. That must have a certain amount of influence in the electoral process as well, no?
Well, it's a very complicated issue. For the United States, it's national security. The conservative sector in the Mexican government has already said, on that, I give in. I accept the United States. I accept your national security. I accept being part of the United States national security system. That's what the Secretary of Economy said, my friend Ildefonso Guajardo. And then we'll discuss economic issues And there the central part is the automobile industry, and everything else is dead. It doesn't exist. So we have to make the proposal the other way around. First is migration, just like in the old negotiation. Like in many international negotiations, they put the issues on the table. My issue is migration. Your issue is national security, and in the middle are the economic issues. If I was a negotiator, I would put migration on the table. In the original NAFTA negotiations, the Mexican government accepted that the fundamental issues were shown into the side agreements, parallel agreements that are non-binding, which are environment, migration, and labor. Very important issues. No, it's backwards. What are the issues that we have?
Migration didn't even make it on the table.
Right, it has to be on the table. So we can be demagogues and say that we're defending Mexicans and not put migration on the table.
But so you're saying there was a quid pro quo. We will accept being part of U.S. national security if we're able to negotiate these economic terms.
There are two extremes. At one end, national security, and in the other, migration. They had to come to a shared position in both things. And in the middle are the economic issues, which can be solved. That's where we have some Trump's wins or something. But no, it's clear that we have a level of economic unity that will keep working as long as Trump doesn't keep insisting that Mexican businesses should go to the United States. That's absurd. There is an economic unity that is working, especially in the automotive and auto parts sector, which are the backbone of NAFTA. It's easily resolvable. It's just business agreement. It can be solved. But it's the principal agreement, based on principles that need to be worked out, on national security and migration.
And that are not being dealt with mainly because the Mexican government hasn't brought them to the negotiations in that same way.
There needs to be strength and firmness. There is no firmness in the negotiation, there are no clear positions.
Speaking of national security, you also said in a recent interview that the new internal security law or homeland security law is a threat to these elections. Could you explain that?
Well, the interior security law, in the first place, the concept of interior security doesn't exist in the federal constitution. There is just the concept of national security. So they invented a concept of internal security, which is kind of a trap, because we need to clarify the situation. The government of Calderón sent the army to fight drug traffickers. The army didn't want to go. They were forced into it. And then the army said, well, if you send us into this war, we need guarantees, which means to violate human rights. So we're in a trap. The situation isn't giving guarantees to the army. The solution is getting the army out of the internal war. That's the solution. Now, it's an issue of gradual change. It's an issue for new policy that we need to negotiate with the army, and the army is very loyal to the country's institutions. It always has been. And we need to say, well, you're going to be withdrawn, but you're not going to be allowed to violate human rights. That's the big negotiation with the army.
In this context, is there a greater risk that the army could be used, for example, to back up a fraud?
I've spoken about that possibility, but fortunately there is a phrase in the internal security law that the armed force can't intervene in social protest. So there's something. Now, is there a risk they could use that law in case of social insurrection? Of course. It's a latent threat. But we need to talk to the army. We need to dialogue with the army. It has to be more open, more democratic, more public. We need to appeal to the army about what it is willing to do and what it is not willing to do. We need a wider, more honest democratic debate.
More transparency. Because one of the concerns is that we're looking at an election where the ruling party is going in with a very unpopular presidency and currently in third place, way behind, which could open the door to...
That's a very good observation. Everything is prepared so that this will end with a contest between Meade and López Obrador. But Meade is at 10% in the polls. So what is the ruling party going to do? Support the candidate of a so-called confederation or alliance led by the PAN? It is possible. It is possible. Today, polls came out that show Anaya, the former president of the PAN, in second place, way ahead of Meade. The issue for the government party is that Meade is unpopular and isn't going to become popular. So what are they going to do? That is the question.
Well, if they did that, would they have to do it like under the table, or would they formally withdraw? Or?
It will be a negotiation. The government can take steps to help the PAN's candidate. Again, it will be very bad. It will mean going back to the PAN government like that of Fox or Calderon. It's a very dangerous danger.
So it's basically beat López Obrador, whatever it takes.
I think that's the logic of history, and national opinion is moving towards respecting López Obrador's victory.
With these elements that you've described. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time.
Yes.
Porfirio Muñoz Ledo, thank you so much.
Gracias a ti.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.
Brutal Israeli assault on Gaza has generated immense devastation for the Palestinians, as Palestinians watch in horror as their very society crumbles around them. Most African American churches and mainstream black organizations refuse to issue any public condemnation of the Israeli assault. That's this week on The Global African. I'm Bill Fletcher. Thanks for joining us. The National Office of the NAACP, which was contacted for this story, acknowledged that no public statement of any kind has been issued by the organization, even after a recent annual convention in Las Vegas, Nevada. The National Urban League, another prominent civil rights organization, has remained silent as well. When contacted for the story, a spokesperson for the Congressional Black Caucus pointed to a statement issued by its members calling for a ceasefire, effectively echoing the official United States position. Martin Luther King once said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." But mainstream organizations in the black community do not seem to adopt that maxim when it comes to the current Palestinian crisis. Today on The Global African, we'll discuss the ramifications of this silence and the larger message that it sends about who's fighting for justice in this country today. Now joining us is Reverend Heber Brown, who is the pastor of Pleasant Hope Baptist Church in Baltimore, Maryland, founding editor of A Reader's Cross, and is himself a humanitarian and social activist. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You watch the pictures of Gaza. What does it make you feel?
I worry and I wonder and I pray for those who I've personally met who are living under occupation and right now under this nightmare of the military incursion into Gaza.
Now, within Black America, there's a historical split on the issue of Israel and Palestine. For many years, beginning with the creation of the State of Israel, it was sort of accepted that you supported this unconditionally. Then after the Six-Day War, there was a shift. And more African Americans began speaking out, raising questions about Palestine. In the current crisis, I hear very little coming out of mainstream Black America.
Yeah, I think it's very unfortunate that these organizations that so many in our society have looked to over the years as credible sources for human rights and rights for African Americans are silent on this issue. I think for me, a part of the reason, my hunch is that it comes down to the relationships that these groups have with foundations and funders that may have politics that are favorable to Israel. And if, for example, your conference or your summit or institute is being funded by a foundation that has a pretty conservative stance on the issue of Palestine-Israel, then it's going to make you at least a little bit hesitant before you speak out.
So that responds to the question of the mainstream black organizations.
Yeah.
But there's also a separate question about what's going on in a black church.
Yeah.
And so the Presbyterians voted in favor of divestment, but you don't hear about that sort of motion within the black church. As a pastor, how do you explain this?
Yeah, I think a part of it is ignorance. There's, I think, and it's not just for the church, I think, and this is a generalization, but Americans don't tend to be as sensitive to foreign policy issues until there's some major crisis, and then we start paying attention, but we pay attention absent of context. And so we cry out or we speak out because of the urgent emergency, but we don't tend to be a nation that is as engaged in world affairs as other nations are. So I think ignorance is a part of that, and that ignorance flows into the church. And I think the other side of the coin too, as a pastor, I say I've witnessed just bad theology, just plain bad theology around Israel. There's the theology that says that Israel is promised land for a chosen people. And so as Jews, because they're chosen of God, have divine right to this land. Right. And this bad theology lives in far too many black churches in particular, and that silences many churches or makes churches vocal in support of what I deem to be racist views against Palestinians.
I was going to ask you about the issue of Christian Zionism in specific. Is that something that you find yourself engaged in struggling, you know?
Definitely. People like John Hagee, who is a televangelist and pastor, started this organization called Christians United for Israel, which is a Christian Zionist organization. And not only do they have inroads into the white evangelical church community, but they have worked to build bridges to the black churches as well. And so a few years ago, they hired, for example, an African-American pastor to be their liaison to the black church community. He went around touting the talking points of Israel and the occupation, and then also they'll throw money together with their partners to send black pastors on what they call Holy Land tours. And they send pastors over there to go around Israel and say, here's where Jesus, prayed.
Theologically, how do you respond when you hear someone say something like, well, this is supposed to be the promised land. This is supposed to be the Jews' land. The Palestinians are interlopers or something.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you respond to that?
Well, personally, I do not equate biblical Israel to the modern nation state of Israel. And so when people just do history and just look at the events of the 40s and the 60s with the creation of the current modern nation state of Israel, you have to consider that in addition to whatever your theology is around the Bible and what the scriptures say. The scriptures don't talk about dinosaurs, but you won't find a black Christian nowhere who say, well, the Bible don't say it, and so I don't believe in dinosaurs. No, we are able to, as thinking people of faith, lay our scriptures right next to what we know of modern history, and then make an informed assessment about what how we understand and engage the world in which we live. I wish more black Christians and black pastors would keep their Bibles, but lay it next to historical facts related to the Palestinians and related to Israel, and then make informed discussions, not just based on a biblical telling of history, because we don't do that in many other areas of our lives. As thinking people of faith, we don't.
Let's look at another angle in terms of the issue of why we're not hearing more from within Black Americas. When, for example, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, issued its statement in 1967, it was demonized. And among the charges was that of anti-Semitism. And within the domestic situation, there are tensions that have existed. We have a complicated relationship with Jews. And do you think that this complicated relationship with Jews that includes allegations that African Americans are anti-Semitic, do you think that that leads people to be reluctant to make criticisms of Israel, or do you think that that's not a factor in what we're seeing?
Yeah, I definitely think it is a factor that, no one wants to be called anti-Semitic. And that is the reflex charge to many of those who speak out against what the Israeli government and the Israeli military is doing. And so that is going to make people think twice, because you don't want to be labeled, nobody wants to be labeled racist, you don't want to be labeled bigot, you want to be homophobe, or no one wants any of those labels. They don't think of themselves in that way. And so that is a factor, I believe, that they don't want to be called anti-Semitic. And I think you're right as well, that it is a complicated relationship between many African Americans and Jews. But isn't that the nature of all relationships? I don't know about your family, but we got some complicated relationships in my own family. And sometimes even in my own family, we have to call each other to the carpet and hold each other accountable, not in the spirit of hatred or destruction, by God, no. It is to help encourage one another so that we might strengthen the bonds of that relationship. So that's what I would say to people who are concerned about the relationship between Jews and African Americans, that if there's charges of anti-Semitism, I would say, hold on, slow down. If we call right and wrong, that does not by its essence mean that we're working for your destruction or that we hate you. It might mean we care about you and we want you to live up to the best of the virtues, values, and traditions that we know are found within the Jewish community, within Judaism proper. And so I think there's some work to do there. When we conflate these terms and when these criticisms just become just reflex, I think it's problematic because in every relationship you have some conflict. And can I also say this, that for those who would say that African Americans are anti-Semitic when they make criticisms of the Israeli government and the Israeli military, it is based on this false premise that all Jews think the same and believe the same on this issue. I know that, and you know that, to be patently false. That there are so many courageous Jews who are standing up, speaking up, and facing immense ridicule from their own community because they're saying, you cannot do this in my name. This is not the best of Judaism. You are besmirching what is the beauty of our culture and our people. And so for those who would charge me, you, or whoever else with being anti-Semitic and just being against Jewish people, I would remind them that there are Jews right now laying their bodies on the line to make sure that there's justice and peace in Palestine, Israel. And we offend their witness when we try to lump all Jews together. There is no people on the face of the planet who all believe the exact same thing on everything. And so I think we need to help people to see that and be sensitive to that. If I'm anti-Semitic, that's news to me, because just less than 24 hours ago, I was marching in the streets of Baltimore City, Maryland, with Jews in Baltimore who were saying, not in my name, free Palestine. They were chanting, Jews were chanting, resistance is justified when occupation, it continues. And so these chants and these beliefs, there's a rich and vibrant spirit for justice and peace within the Jewish community who are standing up on this issue. And I just choose not to offend their courageous witness by believing that they all think the same.
The other day I had a discussion with an elected official, and a very progressive person, including on this issue of Palestine, takes what is called a very balanced view. But one of the things that they said to me was that they were very fearful of speaking up on this because they would face political pushback. In fact, this person is running against somebody in the November elections who is charging that they're insufficiently supportive of Israel. So when we're in a situation where we're trying to win elections, Where does this issue of, what do we say, for example, to Democrats who may be very good on a number of issues, but when it comes to Israel and Palestine, are lockstep with the Israeli government and with AIPAC? What do we say to them?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a hard one because it almost seems like there's a checklist, right? If you want to get elected, here's some things you got to do. You got to work on your image. You got to work on, they go this long list. And somewhere on that list is you have to be vocal about supporting the Israeli military and the Israeli government and the occupation of Palestine. So it's a tough question. I think it gets that much more difficult to answer the higher you go in electoral politics. And so, on the federal level, of course, I think it's becomes even more difficult than it would be on local elections when communities can better surround and come to protect those who want to speak out for justice and righteousness, as I call it. So I would say I would start with the local politicians and start real early. Because the dynamic is that not only do you have to have the quote unquote right views on issues, but you also have to have money to win elections. I mean, that's the prevailing thought and wisdom. And Mr. Fletcher, when we think about the ways that this issue connects back home for black folk, we're talking about black people. And so one of the things that I see as a hurdle for black people is that, for some, they don't see the relevance. They don't see, how does this matter to me? How does this connect with my community? I mean, I'm dealing with lead in the water in my community. I'm dealing with poor schools. I'm dealing with high unemployment. How does this connect? And so it was helpful for me when I went to Palestine, Israel, and I saw for myself the kinship between the oppression faced by African Americans and the occupation faced by Palestinians. Kinship, not only historically, but even modern day. So for example, in cities like Detroit, Baltimore, and the rest, they have technology that's used to conduct surveillance on black and poor communities. Some of that same technology, and in some cases some of the same companies, are involved in the surveillance of Palestinians as well. There's a direct connection there. Black folk in Detroit and in Newark are upset about having these cameras on all in their communities, but of course not downtown in the posh communities. Palestinians are upset as well. Their movement is being restricted by checkpoints and the like. And so there's a kinship right there. There's a kinship when we talk about jobs and that are available to some people and not all people. There's kinship in terms of the discriminatory laws. And so I think the more we connect those dots and the more we point out the hypocrisy. So President Obama, for example, pulls out the talking point that many of the elected officials will say, Israel has a right to defend itself. But Marissa Alexander is facing 60 years in prison right now because she dared to try to defend herself.
That's right.
And so when the more we make those connections, when we think about Emmett Till, and we think about the young Emmett Till and Trayvon Martin and Jordan Davis and Renisha McBride, and we think about the young people of Palestine playing soccer on the beach or being lynched in the occupied West Bank and the like, there's a lot of connection there. I am hopeful that with continued pressing and organizing, particularly between Palestinians, African Americans, and courageous Jews who are in this fight as well, the stronger our coalition can become to put pressure on elected officials, just like AIPAC and other groups do.
Reverend Brown, thank you very much for joining us today in the Global African.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
And thanks for joining us. And we'll be back in a moment. Joining us today for a discussion on this entire question is Reverend Michael Livingston. Reverend Livingston is the former president of the National Council of Churches, former executive director of the International Council of Community Churches, current director of National Public Policy of Interfaith Worker Justice. He's a social activist, humanitarian. Thank you very much, Reverend Livingston, for joining us.
I'm very happy to be with you this afternoon. Thank you for the invitation.
I was trying to figure out how to begin this interview, but let me just come straight to this question. With all of the issues that are facing Black America, why should people give a damn about Palestine?
Because in the church especially, we believe in one common humanity. We're all created in the image of God. what affects one of us affects all of us, and it doesn't matter where it happens. So there ought to be a deep concern on the part of any Christian, certainly, but I would say any person of faith, when devastating circumstances like this exist in even a distant part of the world.
So then, how would you explain, or what would you see as the source of the problem in black churches with regard to raising this issue and having people speaking out? I mean, we have, by way of contrast, the Presbyterian Church, which, as you know, just recently voted to support divestiture. And but you don't hear of that very much coming out of the African American church. What's your take on that?
I think there just isn't enough knowledge and perhaps even interest in looking at this, and I wish that were not the case. There are some small signs of change here, but historically, we've been so engaged in the African American church with the problems of the Black community that to try to engage ourselves in international issues has proven so far to be beyond our ability to focus.
Although, keep in mind, we spearheaded the anti-apartheid struggle in the United States. African Americans were very involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. I mean, we actually have a history of engagement on international issues. It strikes me, though, that there's this relative level of silence when it comes to Palestine.
I think what those two have in common that you just mentioned is one, of course, we're talking about blacks in Africa, and there's a strong kinship there. The Vietnam War, I think there the common denominator was the high proportion of